Hello, and welcome to the third tutorial on auto layouts. Today, we are going to look at the next icon, which is add new constraints. We're going to use the same example. We have a green background for our view, and we have a red box. Now I'm going to click back on structure, and we're looking at our document outline. And notice here again that we have our view, and we have our box. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at the add new constraint icon. Let's click on it and let's look at it very quickly. Here we have four types of constraints. One is for the upper border, one is for the bottom margin, the right, and the left. So notice here that we have another checkbox saying constraint to margins. I'm going to keep that checked. We have other options that are selectable right now as width, height, aspect ratio, and update frames. Okay, so in our past examples, we realized that we have this box, this one view within our view, and we usually need four constraints. So now let's go ahead and click on this icon again, and let's just show an example. Let's go ahead and click on all four and hit add four constraints. And notice here that four constraints popped up. And if we looked at our document outline and click on constraints, notice here we do have the four constraints. Now notice here we have the box leading to leading margin plus 21, trailing margin equals box trailing plus 199, box top equals the top layout guide, and the bottom layout guide is equal to the box bottom plus 398. Okay, so notice here, let's look at this. We have this top layout guide here, and we have base to the bottom layout guide, which is this bottom line right here. Now notice here that we have one based on the trailing margin, which is this margin line right here, and we can click on this one and we have the leading margin, which is this line right here. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is click on the box, and I'm going to go here and clear constraints. So notice here all the constraints went away. I'm going to click on add new constraints again. However, this time I'm going to uncheck the constraint to margins and click all four. And if I hit add four constraints, notice here that we are still looking at our constraints, and we still have now it's going to the, the trailing to the trailing edge. And if I click on this one over here, we have it to the leading edge. So when we uncheck that box, instead of going to the margin, it's going to the edge. However, the top is still going to the top layout guide, and the bottom is still going to the bottom layout guide. So the top and the bottom don't change. However, the left and the right actually went to the trailing, the trailing and the leading. So I'm going to click on it again, and I'm going to clear the constraints. I am going to go back to add new constraints again. So now notice that currently right now this box is we have constrained to margins check. So the top is 23, a length of 23 from the top margin, and 398 from the bottom. Okay, 199 to the right margin, and 21 to the left margin. So let's say that I check on the top one and say let's use standard value, and let's click and use standard value on the bottom, and let's click on these two. So if I click and add four constraints, notice here that they turned orange. Okay, since I'm using standard value is this dotted line right here and this dotted line right here. So remember, in order to get rid of the orange items, you click on the orange, click on the triangle, update frames, and notice here it automatically update the frame. However, I'm going to go ahead and undo it, and remember, if I click on the triangle and click update constraints, it's going to update the constraints. Okay, so now the lines, the orange went away. So now I'm going to click on it again and clear my constraints. So let's go ahead and go to add new constraints again. And this time, let's go to standard value again. Go to the standard value again. And remember, the standard value is going to be a standard value just below the margin and right above the margin. However, if I go to update frames down here and say items with new constraints and add the 4 constraints, it's going to automatically do it for me. So there's 2 ways of doing it. Again, edit, undo change. Let me go ahead and clear the constraints. Okay. Go back to add new constraints. If I go new standard value, click and click. Either if I click add 4 constraints, it's going to show them orange. Click on the triangle, update the frames to fix some misplacements. Or keep going back. Boom. Let's go ahead and add the constraints again. Use standard value. Clicking on all 4. And if I click on update the new constraints and add the 4 constraints, it automatically updates it. Okay. So now let me undo that change. Boom. And I'm going to clear the constraints. Now let's click back on there. So we have an idea now of how this 4 operate. These are based on the margins. Okay, but that's not the only option that we have. We can actually select the width and the height. So let's say, for example, that we do select the width and we do select the height. If I maintain it at 123 and 226 and add the 2 constraints, nothing will be orange for the width and the height. So if I click on that, there it is. It's not orange. However, we do have 2 reds. And the reasoning behind that, remember, that how many constraints that do we need for this box? We need 4, and we only have 2. Okay, so we're going to start looking at these error messages as well. So notice here that in our document outline we show missing constraints. And notice here it says for the box, it says I need a constraint for the X position and I need a constraint for the Y position. So now I can go to add new constraints, click on it, and it says I need a constraint for the X position. So let's click on an X position. Oops, have to click on the box, click on it, and click on an X position. Notice here this is an X position or that's an X position. So let's just click on this one. Add the constraint. Notice here that that error went away. Now it's telling us that we need a constraint for the Y position. So let's go ahead and add a constraint. And let's select this Y. Hit the add the constraint, the error goes away. And if we go back and click on structure, notice here that now we have 1, 2, 3, 4 constraints. We have a constraint within the box. Notice here they're broken up because the box has in itself 2 constraints that solely reflect upon this box. And we have 2 constraints that are reflective upon this view, and they're reflective upon this view to the box. Okay, so let me click on it again, clear the constraints. Okay, let's click on it right there. Let's click on add new constraints. So let's say now if we click on a width and a height and change this to 200 and change this by 200. Okay, so now knowing that I changed the values here, notice here when I click on it, we should get some orange triangles come up with some orange values, of orange constraints pop up. So let's see if that happens. Add constraints. Actually, they came up red. So let's go ahead and click on here. And notice here that actually they came up red because we still need the X and we still need the Y. So let's go ahead and add the X and add the Y, add those 2 constraints. Okay, now it came up orange. Okay, click on it and let's update the frames. Boom. Now we have a box of 200 by 200. Okay, and if I click on the structure and go back to the constraints, again notice here that we have 4 constraints. The width is height is 200, the width is 200. I can go over here to our utility and change this to 300 if I wanted to. There we go. It increased to 300. I can click on the width and give that a scale of 300 as well. And we have a square. Okay, so I'm going to take this, bring it back in. Notice here they came up orange again. So if I wanted to keep these constraints, remember, I can click up here, click on the triangle, and say Update Constraints. And hit Fix Misplacement, and it'll update the constraints. Edit Undo Constraints. If I wanted to go to the frames, with respect to the frame, it'll go back to the frame. Hope that makes sense. Let's go ahead and bring this back in. Click on it and clear the constraints. Now, here's another one here. We looked at these four, which is with respect to the left margin, to the right margin, to the top margin, to the bottom margin. If I uncheck this, this is still with respect to the top margin and the bottom margin. However, this is with respect to the left view and to the right view. Okay, so we keep this checked. Notice how those numbers change. We checked on the width, we checked on the height. That gives us a constant size of the width and the height. We've adjusted those numbers. Okay, so let's uncheck those and let's look at this next one called aspect ratio. So if I click on aspect ratio and hit add one constraint, notice here, let's see what happens. Okay, I'm going to go back to the structure and I'm going to look for that constraint. Notice here it's under the box. I check on it. There's one constraint that says it's an aspect ratio from 5 to 7. So just thinking back on our process here, we have one constraint and we know that we're going to need a total of 4. So we're missing 3 constraints. So if we click on the little red icon, and notice here right now it shows us that we're missing 2 constraints. So let's see what's going on. Need constraints for X position. So we know that it says if we need a constraint for the X position, we know that we need a constraint for the left margin or the right margin. So let's correct that. Let's go to add new constraint. Make sure it's checked. Click on it and we can select either one. Oops, I need to select it. Hold on. There we go. Okay, and let's give it the right margin. Okay, so we add that constraint. And now let's see what else we got now. It says need constraints for Y position, and we need a constraint for either X position or width. Okay, so let's clear this one out. It says need a constraint for Y position. So Y position means that we're going to need a constraint either from the top margin or from the bottom margin. Click on the icon, go to add new constraint, and let's click on a Y and hit one constraint. Okay, now let's see what it's telling us here. So if we go back to the structure and look at the constraints, notice here that we have 1, 2, 3 constraints. So we're missing one constraint. So let's click back on here, but it's showing us that we have 2 different errors here. So it's saying that we need a constraint for the X position or width, or need a constraint for the Y position or height. So if you just attack one at a time, and maybe both will go away. And actually that's what's going to happen. If you either solve this one or solve that one, then both the errors will go away because we know that we just need one more constraint. So let's work on the bottom one. It says need a constraint for the Y position or height. Okay, and the reason it's saying that is because if we go back to the structure and look at this, we have an aspect of 5 to 7. So if we give it a height or a width, we will resolve this last constraint. So let's go ahead and give it a height. Or we can give it a Y position, but let's go ahead and give it a height. So let's click on the square, click on the add new constraint, and let's give it a height. Check on the height, hit add constraint, and the error messages disappear. So if we click on structure, and notice again, we do have 4 constraints. Okay, so let's click on it again, and let's clear the constraints. Again, click on the box, click on the add new constraints. Okay, so we can just let's just pick a height, and let's go do another example exercise here. So let's click on the height and let's hit this add new constraint. Okay, so notice here, of course, we're going to come up with a red arrow because we're missing constraints. So if I click on the down caret and click on the constraints, we have a height of 161. So it's going to probably tell us that we're missing 3 constraints. Let's click on the red arrow. And notice here, let's follow the instructions here. Need constraints for X position, width, need constraints for Y position. So let's attack these one at a time. Need constraints for X position. X position means that we need a constraint either from this edge to the left margin or from the box edge to the right margin. So let's click on it and let's add a constraint. And let's just go ahead and add the right one. Hit one constraint and there we go. Now notice here that error disappeared. So now we need a constraint for the X position or width. So let's give it the other X position. So let's click on the box, click on add new constraint, and let's click on the left position. Add one constraint. Good. Now we're saying that we need a constraint for a Y position. So let's click on the box and let's click on add new constraint and let's click on the bottom one because that's the Y position and add the new constraint. There we go. They all disappeared, all the errors disappeared. We click on structure and we click on the down caret. Notice here that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 constraints. Okay, let's click on it one more time. Let's do one more. Clear constraints. And let's move this box down here. How about right here? Good. Okay, so now let's say that we know that we need 4 constraints. So we can pick any 4 that we want and then we should be able to resolve the issue. So let's click on 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. Hit add 4 constraints. Good. No errors. Edit, undo. Okay. But let's see what happens here if we click 4 constraints. Let's click on a top and a bottom and a width and a height. Add those 4. Uh-oh, we come up with an error. Okay, so let's click on this error and see what happens here. It says need constraints for an X position. So let's go over here and add an X position. Hit add one constraint. There we go. Disappears. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we do have five constraints, but obviously we only need 4. So there's an extra one, but that's okay. Just as long as we have 4 and it's not complaining, we will be fine. So let's see which one that we don't need. We have this one, and a height. Okay, so we have a top margin, bottom margin, and a height. So I believe that if we just take away one of these, we'll still be fine. So let's take away this top margin. Oop, we're fine. Okay, because we have the height and we have the bottom from the bottom margin. So that's all we need. We could have taken away this one and we would still be fine. Or we could take out the bottom one and still be fine. Okay? Alrighty, I think that's enough for the third lesson. So I hope you have a nice day and I'll look forward to seeing you on the next lesson.